Hello, welcome to Free Will Science Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, Trick Slattery, Mitch J, and Michael Walsh. And for this episode, we're actually going to be responding to some Facebook comments I received from this friend who asked to be presented as the commenting dude bro who frames his moral code after Immanuel Kant, Jainism, and the Batman. Um, he's a fun guy, and he's been following and reading and commenting on my Facebook posts for some time. But here's how it started. Now, Trick Slattery, who's one of our co-hosts, he posted a link that religious children are meaner than their secular counterparts, study finds. And then one of the commenters said, religion is not good if it teaches free will as truth. That study is fatally flawed. And then that began a big conversation. So this commenting dude bro said, I'm not sure how teaching that free will is true is harmful. If free will can determine to be a lie, the lie itself is not necessarily harmful. And then it looks like Trick Slattery commented. I guess Trick, did you want me to read your this
Yeah,
comment?
go right ahead, Chandler. You can
Okay,
read
yeah.
that.
And what Trick said was, per the study, children from religious households frequently appear to be more judgmental of others' actions. This stems from the belief that someone could have done otherwise. The study also found that religiosity affects children's punitive tendencies. Free will has a number of huge consequences, from blaming others to the rationalization of inequalities as you think one is more or less deserving than another, to giving a reason to hate, in a strong sense, to retributivism, and so on. Yeah, so, okay, anyway, so I think all the co hosts that we have present here are going to agree with what Trick said here. Free will belief is not some benign thing that's not harmful. We know that it causes great harm because, I mean, and I tend to think that any false belief has a tendency to cause people to act outside of the way reality works, and that's really bad. I'm sure Mitch would agree with that because he cares about reality.
Here, here.
Yeah. And so then the commenting dude bro said, Trick Slattery, would the knowledge of having no free will not justify a person's hatred? They cannot be blamed for said anger. Are we saying people have no free will at all? No person can be called moral or immoral then because no one is responsible for anything they do? Okay, so as we see here, he's already confused between morality and moral responsibility. But Trick responded to this as well.
Are we just gonna go ahead and just read everything, or maybe we should have people just interject?
I want all of the co-hosts to be able to weigh in on this because I think the big confusion here, the first one problem that happened was the confusion between morality and moral responsibility. So we can go into that, and then we could also address the confusion between determinism and fatalism, as we've done that before, but we're trying to clear up the confusion that this guy has. So first of all, basically we have morality in the sense that depending on the moral framework, we've done whole episodes about morality. An action can be defined as moral or immoral given a certain moral framework, but this has nothing to do with whether somebody's morally responsible in the sense of having a choice and could have done otherwise that free will belief entails. So, would anyone like to weigh in on that?
So basically, yeah. So basically, he's confusing morality and moral responsibility, and I think this is something that we see quite often is people get the two confused. They think that if somebody isn't morally responsible, that there's no such thing, or morality doesn't apply, and it automatically reverts to some sort of, I guess, nihilism. And it might be the case that a non-free will person is a nihilist, but I'm not, and I don't think it necessarily follows from the lack of free will that you have to be a nihilist just because someone doesn't isn't morally responsible. What would you say that on that, Mitch?
Well, I think you know where I stand on this position. I agree with you there. Although I don't think morality is some special magical property that we necessarily have to have or find, I think it's very, very useful. And I don't think the rejection of free will prevents society at large from dealing with problematic individuals. This is one of the fears that people who investigate free will have. They fear that if we say free will doesn't exist, well, we can't blame or praise anyone. We won't be able to um, deal with violent criminals, for example, in society. And of course, this is bogus. You know, we've said many times in this show, and I guess it bears repeating, so we'll say it again today, that if someone, for example, does a violent act, we need to find out the source of that person's behavior and try to reform that person. We still have to take that person away from society and try as humanely as possible to deal with that problem, perhaps so it doesn't happen again, or perhaps out of some desire to turn that person into a productive member of society and eventually reintroduce them.
Right. And even before we, we recognize that somebody did an immoral act, and we, have to do something because of that, can somebody learn to act morally?
Certainly, of course.
Right.
I mean, we teach children morality, don't we? We teach children morals, right?
And that's the main point is the people who think that because you're not morally responsible, like if you do something immoral, for example, that you're not really truly responsible for that immoral act. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't learn about morality and you can't action those moral findings, basically. So that's the key here. What do you say, George?
We're introducing to the world a new paradigm of understanding, and because of that, we need, in some cases, a new terminology. In other words, so like, for example, with responsibility, we might want to distinguish between fundamental responsibility, which no one has, and quote unquote pragmatic responsibility. And then, like, in terms of morality, I don't think we can logically ascribe morality to anyone or perhaps even anything. So we would address moral and immoral acts rather than agents.
Yeah, exactly. Right. The main point is we don't need to point fingers to solve problems. What we need to do is solve problems. If someone is out in an open field shooting children, that's a problem. But saying something like this person is evil or this person is bad, or creating these arbitrary rules for how long someone has to be removed from society, this is what we're doing wrong. And understanding that free will is nonsense, rejecting free will, helps us to get to the root of these problems. So it's nothing but beneficial.
Right. So I would say that with the understanding that we lack free will, our moral framework has to change. There's certain moral frameworks that are incompatible with that idea. They just don't work with it. The moral framework that we would have to work with is one that is all about future actions and how we interact with people causally, basically. So it's a causal moral system, basically. The one that doesn't work is the one that morally blames people for what they have done in the past, basically. Even though we like George said, we pragmatically might have to invoke some kind of consequences onto those people in order to prevent them from doing it in the future, or things like that.
Yeah, Trick, I think you've made some pretty good examples before in the past, great analogies. You said like do we blame non-living things? Do we blame hurricanes for what they do? Do we blame tornadoes? Do we blame even animals? We don't really blame animals, right? We say a lion does what it does. It's instinct. It's nature. Yet for some reason, when it comes to human beings, we act like human beings are magical. What did Sam Harris say? We are not self-caused little gods. So all of a sudden, when we talk about human beings, we act as if we are more than our biology. We are more than anything else.
Mitch, I'm totally in agreement with what you just said here, because people do have this sort of a speciesist idea that other animals aren't to blame. It's just nature, it's just instinct. But human beings have something extra, they claim. They claim that humans have some extra thing that makes them blameworthy or creditworthy. And that's what they think free will is, that free will is some kind of special human thing, and there's no it's incoherent anyway, but it's strange how they do that. The fact that they treat humans as being different from animals, non-living things, tsunamis, hurricanes, etc.
Right.
Well, we do have to, in some ways, I guess, make distinctions between
Mhm.
like humans and rocks, for example. For example, a rock can't think about what is moral to do and then act on that thing, but humans can, even though if they do, it's just as causal as that rock. It's still an important distinction that we have to, I think, still have to kind of understand, right?
Yeah, there is a distinction between living and non-living things, conscious and unconscious things, and none of us on this podcast are denying that there's a difference between a human and a rock. Where we differ, though, from a lot of people, though, is we're saying basically that there's not a difference between humans and other animals that makes them more or less blameworthy. We just realize that all behavior is caused, and when, like Mitch said about someone shooting children with a gun in a field or something, we see that as a problem because it causes pain, and we will automatically, if we don't like that, work to correct it, do something. We may disagree on what the something is that needs to be done with that person, but we agree that something needs to be done.
Right. Though same thing. We can't really attribute morality, for example, to animals that can't think about a moral system or anything like that. But we can with humans. But you're right when it comes to blame. We can't blame the human anymore. We can blame an animal or a rock, even though we can ascribe, a moral system to a human, right?
Right. Well, exactly. Understanding the agent or the proximate cause of what's happening helps us to solve the problem. So understanding the differences, because like you said, there are differences between a human and a rock, does help us solve the problem. We know what kind of influences are needed to direct human behavior, just like we know what kind of influences are needed to affect naturalistic processes. So,
Exactly. If a
go
rock
ahead.
is rolling down the hill about to hit somebody in the head,
Mhm.
we know that we have to physically push that rock
Right.
so it doesn't, hit the person on the head. Whereas if a person is coming towards another person running down a hill for some reason, we say, "Hey, move out of the way," right? So
Exactly.
so those are just different causal influences, but they're just as causal, I guess.
Yeah, and here's an interesting analogy that's sort of interesting. Now, let's just say that a rock, let's say that somebody throws a rock at somebody's head, and the rock hits him, and that causes them pain. But they say they don't see the person who threw the rock, and then they blame the rock and try to punish that rock for hitting them in the head and get all mad and wish for it to burn in hell forever, having all this anger directed at this rock, believing that rock to be the self-causer of it flinging itself at their head, you know but
And
I know it sounds funny.
Chandler, yeah, also what has to change, one of the most important aspects of this shifting from a free will to no free will perspective has to do with rehabilitation. I mean, basically, when people do something that we define or consider societally as wrong, we want to address that, right? But in the current system, and this involves the police, judges, the media, newspapers, the public in general, we will label that person a criminal, evil, bad. I mean, like, if you've seen some of the headlines sometimes that they have, and the problem with this is that, in psychology, if you have all of society, pretty much calling you evil and a criminal and, all this, a lot of worse sometimes, chances are, more likely than not, you're going to like you're going to see yourself in that way, or it's going to be difficult to not see yourself in that way. So basically, we have to like shift from that to like to never kind of like, I mean, we're hedonic creatures, so if we want to consider ourselves all good people, it doesn't make sense completely logically, but I don't think that'd be a horrible thing. But we should never, consider anyone, evil, a criminal, bad. We should never attach that label to them because, that's going to make, you know, getting, because like the, the other, the way things should happen is like, the police, judges, the whole system should be very clear to explain to people, listen, we know this is happening to you. We know you're not doing this. We know you're not evil, whatever. But, we have to do what we have to do. And that way, that person doesn't feel labeled so negatively that he has to fight that in addition to kind of like understanding why what he did was wrong and, just correcting his behavior. So that's this is a very fundamental key part of this whole, mission we're on, to just basically to remove that the stigmatizing label that we apply not just to criminals, we apply to ourselves, to everyone else. I mean, like to the extent we can see ourselves either as neutral, neither good or bad, or as just like fundamentally good because it makes us feel good to feel that way. That's going to help so much in rehabilitation.
Right. In
Well,
a
hold on. I got a question. Do you guys all think that the concept of evil makes no sense at all? Do you think that determinism or non-free will means that any notion of evil must be totally expunged?
I find the word evil kind of, I don't know, a word that I like to abandon personally because I think it has too much religious baggage to it. I think there's actions that lead to negative experiences, and those negative experiences are the problem, I think, or positive experiences and so on. So if you want to call negative experiences evil, then of course evil still exists, but it's not that people are necessarily evil. Even a psychopath, a psychopath has a I would consider them more broken than evil. There's a mechanism that's broken that's causing them to not have empathy and harm others, basically.
Well, I tend to agree with Trick on that because the word evil has a lot of baggage with it. I prefer, to use terms like good or bad, and I use those as synonymous with pleasure and pain. But the word evil tends to bring with it this idea that a person can be evil, like the evil is a noun almost. Whereas I think of evil or bad or negative or pain as more of an experience, more of a verb. Like there can be an action that's good or bad. There can be an action that causes pleasure or pain as its effects. But I think, yeah, we can't really label a person or a tsunami or whatever as being that thing has an attribute of goodness or badness. I don't think that makes any sense.
I think we're all in agreement here. I mean, I personally think when human beings in particular are said to be evil and do horrific things like commit horrendous acts of violence or pain or suffering, it's because they're crazy. It's insanity. That's what it is, right? It's all about your brain. This is determinism, cause and effect. People who act in a very different way than other people act that way because their physical brains are different. There's always a cause behind it. So
Yes.
so when someone does, the few people on earth, even criminals, the majority of criminals, when they do criminal activities, they justify it. They have their own sort of ethical codes, their own moral standards, and they feel as if even when they do something bad, they were justified in doing it. They were either forced to do it in some sense, or they were actually just a victim, like a criminal killing another criminal, or someone robbing a bank because, hey, it's my job to rob the bank. The cop shot me, so I shot him back. I feel like criminals justify their actions in this kind of manner. So the few people who do horrific things, people that mainstream society would want to call evil, from my perspective, they're crazy.
Well, yeah, I agree
It's
there
like,
because for one thing, it's not in their best interest. When people do, violent acts and all kinds of crazy things, it's not in their best interest because it ends up hurting them in the end. And so a lot of us, we don't do certain things because we know it will cause pain to us. And so I think there's a difference between I don't like the words normal or healthy because I don't
sure.
like the idea of saying, well, this person has a healthy brain, this person has an unhealthy brain. But I think generally to think that most people are actually not violent criminals. Sure, there's a lot of bad examples. If somebody looks on the news, you can find all kinds of violent acts of murder and rape and genocide and all that. But a lot of us don't do those things, and we as a society want people to not be doing those things because it hurts.
Right. And
Okay,
violent people don't recognize this, so clearly they don't view the world from this same perspective. Something is different about them. But
guys,
evil has too much baggage.
I agree with, well, here's the thing. I agree with you that evil should never be applied to a person. But for example, let's say we were considering happiness. With happiness, there's certain various degrees of happiness. One can be mildly satisfied, content. One can be happy. One can be blissful or euphoric. So, these terms like bliss or ecstasy, they refer to great levels of happiness, right?
Mhm.
So, like, consider bad, like things that are like, and basically how I, define good and bad, good and evil and all, is according to what John Locke said, British philosopher. He said, goodness is that which creates happiness. It's not a completely, airtight definition, but in general, it expresses so, all right, so if goodness leads to happiness, then evil, good and evil, because that tends to be they tend to go together in that same way. That connotes something that leads to unhappiness. Now, here's the thing. So, like in dealing with ourselves, in dealing with acts, in other words, like you know, speeding, going 5 miles over the speed limit might be bad. Going torturing animals, I think the different words to connote different levels of evil, I think, might be helpful, so that like we don't have one blanket term and like, people end up believing, well, no one thing is actually more bad than the other.
Yeah, I agree with you there, George, because certain things cause much more harm than others. Some things cause much more pleasure than others, and so we can't act like it's just either this or it's that and not make distinctions of degrees of these things. I get what you're saying there.
Michael, what's your opinion? You brought this question up. Do you think there's evil?
Well, here's how I define evil: lacking empathy or compassion. And so it's a very simple definition, and it can be used to define people acting a certain way. It's just a description of a certain set of events. Like, for example, suppose you walked into a room and you saw a person, I don't know, torturing a dog, for example. You could say that person is evil because he's lacking empathy and compassion towards another sentient being. And
Which
so given that definition, I don't think the notion of evil needs to be thrown out entirely, even non-free will or anything. Evil is just a description of people doing certain things.
would you consider a machine that is harming somebody evil?
No, because the being doing the evil has to be capable of empathy and compassion. So obviously, a tornado can't be evil because it's just a tornado, even though it causes massive amounts of suffering.
So
So it
if a
has to
psy-
be something capable of it.
if a psychopath has a something configured in its brain which prevents it from having empathy, then it's incapable of it, isn't it not?
Um, Possibly, yeah. Someone whose brain is damaged in such a way that they are physiologically unable to even consider the way another being would see the world, its pain or its suffering. that person would be essentially mentally ill, and that would be incapable of evil. So it would
Well,
have to be someone who was capable of being empathetic, but simply just lacks it in a particular time.
All right, but Mike, I think you're
yeah.
falling into the labeling of a person, who obviously, like, most fundamentally, a person cannot either be evil or good because nothing we do is up to us. So in other words, like, I think evil might refer to an act I mean, what's the outcome of lacking empathy or compassion? That
Well,
outcome
I
is
am I am labeling the act evil. I'm not labeling the person evil. I'm saying like person X doing Y to person Z is an evil act.
right. But what Trick was bringing up is that kind of definition can apply to human beings, but then like there are like so are we saying that we can only attribute evil and goodness to an act that a human being does, and that we can't extend that to like great weather? That's a good thing.
Exactly, of course. Yeah, it has to be done by a being capable of empathy and compassion.
But if they're when you say they're capable of empathy and compassion, but they're not empathizing or having compassion, then I would say they're not capable at that time of having empathy or compassion. Correct?
They have to be intrinsically capable of it, meaning there's nothing physiologically wrong with them that prevents them from doing so, like brain damage or being like a lower level animal, like a dog or a
See,
Well,
rabbit or something like that.
well,
I
Mike.
see no distinction between that and just someone's brain configuration not allowing them to have empathy or compassion at a certain time due to all of the variables that have led to that state.
Well, if I can, Mike. Well, let's talk about the utility of it. I mean, when's the last time you called someone evil?
Uh, I don't know, maybe a month ago or something.
I mean, I
But
haven't described someone as evil. I can't. I must have
Mitch,
been
Mitch, the
since I
New
was
York,
like 13 years old or
the
something. The
Daily
last,
News does it. Yes, but the Daily News, like
I
these, they do it all the time. Like somebody like commits, the headline, "Rot in Hell." They, you're
Like,
right.
right. Let's talk about Hitler, for example. Right. Like when you first learn about Hitler,
You
and you're
had to
really
bring up
young.
Hitler.
What do you?
It only took us what,
Does it?
30 minutes to get to Hitler. All
When
right.
you're, there's a reason. Anyway, when you're really young, right? The first person you want to hate is like Hitler or something. But then you get older and you learn so much and you get so intelligent, it just goes away. You just start feeling sorry for people. Of course, you feel sorry for all the people who were murdered and tortured and round up and persecuted. But then you start learning the circumstances of the Nazi Party and Hitler's background and how he grew up, and it's like, it's like especially in light of determinism. You know what I mean? Do I hate Hitler? No. Do I think Hitler was evil? Not really. I think he was a deluded, crazy guy who was a victim of anti-Semitism, which was, the flavor, which was the zeitgeist at that time, especially after Germany and Austria, after going through World War I and everything. There
Okay,
was
would you
so
would you say that what Adolf Hitler did was evil?
I don't think it's even necessary, but I mean, it's a good question. Hmm.
Because I'm saying if the only that's the only concept of evil that I find even remotely plausible. So at most, I think evil should be that.
But if you're
Absolutely. Anything that like lessens, I mean, like evil might be a strong word for like, stepping on somebody's foot or something, but when you kill and torture a lot of people, I think the
but
person's not evil, but that act is supremely
but the
evil.
word evil has baggage. Like I would say something like what he did was horrific. It was
But
repugnant.
what's
I
the
wouldn't say
baggage?
evil.
What's the baggage of evil that you feel is counterproductive?
Well, it's the same thing we discussed earlier. Like usually when it's applied to an agent, how it implies there's some intrinsic quality and some choice to do bad things, which is the
Well,
reason why I would avoid that kind of language.
but that's the thing. So like we have to kind of like re-educate the world, right?
Mhm.
To go from labeling people as evil to labeling acts as evil. But again, we're faced with this kind of like, I think, um, need, or that it would be a good thing to have different degrees of goodness and badness. So I don't know, horrific. I mean, like, a lot of people don't even know what horrific means. I mean, I don't know.
So, George, are you saying that like you would have some words that imply an extreme amount of bad, whereas other words that imply a little amount of bad?
I think, yeah, because, like, one of the most fundamental aspects of morality is that's morality is about. We have choices between the greater of two goods, the lesser of two evils. Very very rarely are acts like, completely good, or, well, I'm not sure about very rarely, but in a lot of cases they're like, to do some good you've got to do a little bad. So yeah, to kind of, like, and then it becomes an equation, like, torturing animals. I think that's really really horrible. However, when you
Hmm.
within the context of a lab that's, developing cures for human beings, it might not be as evil and all. But I think, yeah, I think the distinction helps people to understand, that that badness or evil isn't like, you can't say, well, I'm not going to judge between two different kinds of bad. There, what's bad is bad, what's good is good. No, I think it's very helpful to have that kind of distinction.
Yeah, well, George, I agree, and here's why. Because take, for example, the four classic examples of bad things. Basically murder, or we'll just say killing, because murder is such a loaded word. Let's just say killing, stealing, lying, and raping. These four things of, kill, lie, steal, or rape are like the four classic examples when someone gives an example of something that's bad or immoral or evil or whatever word. But we can admit that these are not all equally bad. For example, we wouldn't say that stealing money is or something is necessarily the same as killing somebody, because if something is stolen, it can theoretically be paid back. You know what I mean? It can be restored, the damage can be undone. So I think that there is a distinction to be made there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, this is really good talk so far, because so far we agree that things can be labeled as good or bad, actions can be good or bad, or moral or immoral. But this is not the same as moral responsibility. Um,
Right.
yeah.
So the other issue, the other Facebook thing you wanted to address was fatalism, right? The different distinction between determinism and fatalism.
Yes, definitely. So now, so who would like to go on that? I mean, I could if no one else wants to. I could, but
Let's hear what you have to say on it, Chandler.
all right. So basically, determinism and fatalism have a major difference, because fatalism tends to be this idea that something is fated by a deity or by some magic, that you will die at a certain time on a certain day, without any cause being required for this to happen. That like things are scheduled and predetermined in that sense of scheduled, and so nothing you do makes a difference. Whereas determinism, just means that everything is causal. So if you do die, there's going to be a cause for that. And it's, for example, remember that example I gave in that one episode of fatalism? Like, it is God's will for you to be fat. So no matter what you eat or don't eat, you will be fat.
I didn't hear
And
that one.
that's an example of fatalism, where something is going to be a certain way and you can't change it. Whereas determinism, just means that everything that you think, feel, say, and do is caused. So yes, you can, if something is bad and you don't like it, then yes, you can change it, but only if you had the causal history or the causal luck to be able to have the know-how, and the motivation, or perhaps the money required to do a certain thing. So determinism is much, much more hopeful than fatalism, because yes, you can still do what you want, you just can't choose your own desires.
Right. So these are the two great fears that people have when investigating free will. People who would become free will skeptics, they fear what we discussed earlier, this issue of moral responsibility. how are we going to deal with criminals? How can we have a society if we can't blame or praise people? I think we sufficiently address that issue. And then the second topic is this idea of fatalism. Why should we do anything if nothing we do is up to us? But this is just illogical because the point of determinism, as you suggested, Chandler, is that things matter, influences matter. The right set of influences determine what happens. Something causes something else to happen. Furthermore, if one truly understands determinism, one has to understand that we can't stop what's happening from happening. So you don't get to choose to do nothing. You know what I mean? They act as if because of this knowledge, we can choose to not do anything. No, the idea is that you can't choose anything. You can't affect how information will affect you. You don't know the impact that information will have. So, in reality, when people are being fatalistic, when people are saying this will lead to fatalism, what they're afraid of is that society at large, if they're not sufficiently informed, people will become fatalistic. That's the idea. That people that don't have the big picture, people who don't have um, all of the all of the literature, haven't really figured out the consequences of rejecting free will become fatalistic because of this lack of information.
Which
So I've yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, which is exactly why we're trying to give them all the information. You know,
Right,
we
exactly.
yeah, we do that in this podcast, and and George is an Exploring the Illusion of Free Will show. Is gone through so many topics and explaining it, and it took more than one episode for me to get it to. Because there is this fear that people have when they don't understand about free will. Right at the beginning, they might think that it leads to fatalism, but that's just because they're not familiar with the topic yet. And one of the problems is that when I first got introduced to the no free will message, I confused it with Calvinism, you know, which is not necessarily the same thing, because sure, under Calvinism, which is a type of fatalism, I'd say, everything that happens is God's will, and so you don't have choice under that system. But the big issue is that that's always tied in with the idea that, oh, you're predestined to either go to heaven or hell, regardless of the fact that you don't deserve anything. And we're not saying anybody's going to heaven or hell on this podcast. There is a major difference.
I'm going to heaven. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a whole other episode right there.
I know where I'm going.
Yeah, but yeah, so I mean,
Hunter.
fatalism is very different from determinism because, okay, first of all, there's two different things. There's determinism, that everything that happens is caused, and then there's indeterminism, which allows for the idea that at least some events have no cause, which I don't believe, but a lot of people do. But that doesn't make it any more up to you. So you still don't get choice if you are randomly, for no reason, caused to eat Cheerios on a certain day.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's the first thing that people, when they learn that about the no free will position, is they revert to fatalism, which kind of leads to feudalism, basically, that they think things are futile. You might as well not do anything. Or what's the point? Whatever. But determinism, and I have an infographic on this that kind of explains how um, going to the doctor, you actually calling the doctor is part of the cause that would lead you to being cured, for example. Whereas for fatalism, whether you're cured or not is regardless of whether or not you call the doctor. So those are two big, huge distinctions that we have to look at.
Exactly. And we have this understanding that something isn't going to happen unless we cause it to happen. We desire for a certain thing to happen, and our actions bring that thing about. But we're not saying that we are, fundamentally blameworthy or credit worthy for how things turned out because we did not create ourselves, we didn't choose our own desires, and that's what so many people are missing. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills.
Mhm.
Schopenhauer.
Right, yeah. Another thing is human beings, we have these biases. We place emphasis on certain events and not on others. Look, so another example, Trick gave the one about the doctor. I think we talked about this maybe a few weeks ago. uh, People talk about sometimes studying for exams. They go, well, okay, if determinism is true, here's the fatalistic point of view, right? Why should I study for this exam? Whatever grade I'm going to get is fated anyway. But that shows an emphasis, a human bias on the results of the particular exam. The event of studying is also an event, but it's an event that humans just don't care about. Another interesting thing to think about is, wow, will I end up studying for the test or won't I? I can't control whether or not I end up studying for the exam. But if I study for the exam, if that event happens, certainly you might assume that I'm more likely to do well on the exam. So if you turn your attention to the event of studying for the exam and think, wow, what's going to happen right now? And then the event happens that you do study, you can sort of have a different perspective on reality and on determinism.
Right. Or it might be that you're confused on the fatalism, and you actually believe in fatalism and you believe things are futile, so you don't study for the exam and you fail the exam because of this incorrect um, belief in fatalism, basically. So it can be that you have an incorrect belief in fatalism that leads to the next causal event, which is you not studying for the test.
Yeah, I mean, and here's another thought. Let's suppose somebody doesn't even go to school or class or wherever and take the exam, that they don't even show up. Then they're not going to get it. They're going to get a bad grade or no grade at all because they didn't show up. And so it's not like it's going to happen whether or not they study or whether or not they actually take the test. They know that to get that it's going to be brought about causally. And so, if somebody who mistakes it for fatalism and thinks that it's already predetermined no matter what they do, instead of predetermined because of what they do.
Exactly, exactly. It's not just one event that you like that's predetermined. The whole chain of events is a causal chain. But we're just paying attention to one link, or the fatalist might succumb to this temptation to only pay attention to one link in the chain. So that's the issue.
Yeah, it's very important because I think what people are missing is that they are able. In fact, here's what's so ironic. We don't have the choice to do nothing. We're always forced to do something in one way or another, and we automatically end up doing the things that we like and doing more. We eat more of the foods that we like. We play more of the games that we like to play. And there's still great happiness or joy to be found in certain activities. It's just that whether or not we succeed or fail at these areas isn't really up to us, but through practice and experience, we get better at a task that is repeated. So I don't see any problem or any reason to feel bad or hopeless about it.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. Anything could, if the right set of influences come along, you could be anything. You can be
Yeah.
very optimistic about it.
Yeah, it's very important because, in a sense, we could say that humans are capable of being reprogrammed or reshaped, just rebuilt into something else. You're not necessarily gonna be the same person today as you were 10 years ago, and in 10 years from now, you might be a different person because your belief system and your knowledge has changed so much that you act differently at a different stage in your life because
Exact,
yeah.
exact. I never would have predicted that at my age right now, I would be incredibly interested in the issue of free will. I would have never predicted when I was 17 years old that I would have acquired several degrees in mathematics and would have become interested in philosophy and God to this extent. So you never know. The right set of influences come along, and then you change a lot.
Yeah, and in that sense, we're not able to predict what will happen, so there's still the surprise. There's that element of excitement, just like you watch a movie. You know that the movie before you even watch it, it is already recorded. You know that the movie will turn out the way it will turn out, and that it's not up to you because you didn't make the movie, but you still want to watch it because it's a thrilling experience.
Indeed.
Right. So, all right. The flaws in fatalism, I think there's maybe two or three. One is it presupposes foreknowledge that we can know, how things are going to go out. The fatalism says like things are going to turn out the way they turn out, regardless of what they do. And actually, that's a flaw in itself, because like when you think about it, things are not going to turn out the way they turn out, regardless of what we do. It's because of what we do. But the third thing is like it's more experiential. I mean, I don't think we have to worry much about people becoming fatalists, because I think there's examples in books. Basically, we're hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And so, like, to the extent that we would say that we would give up our ambitions and just like, whatever is going to happen, that's going to bring negative consequences. And, we learn from that. We just like, I think Sam Harris, other people like bring up the example of like, well, I'm not going to get up out of bed because like, everything's predetermined anyhow, whatever. And that, pretty soon, or not studying for a test, like I'm not going to study for the test because what's going to happen happens. I think we learn pretty quickly that that's a pretty flawed strategy for living one's life.
It may
So,
happen to
Well,
some people.
I'd be a little hesitant to say that though, because I think that fatalism is definitely one of the biggest pitfalls that people fall into as they're learning about determinism. I mean, I had a coworker of mine who had a degree in physics. He's a very smart, educated guy, and we were having a conversation about free will. And I said, "Well, what would you do if he's a skeptic of it?" And I'm basically trying to convince him, giving him all the reasons, the arguments, the evidence, and all that. And I asked him, I was like, what would you think if you suddenly realized that free will is an illusion? And he was like, wow, I'd probably just commit suicide.
yeah, but I mean,
I don't
I
know.
had
I think he
somebody.
was joking to a degree, but then basically he gave me the whole fatalistic point of view, saying, "Oh, well, what's the point of doing anything? Well, why study? Why go on a date? Why do anything?
But
It's
Michael,
a
that's what I'm saying.
natural."
Mike, all right, I had somebody say that in a meetup like about a month ago. Actually, I was talking to her in person, whatever. She said, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to live anymore." But these people are just saying that again, like this your friend. Once he would like, if the guy's like really smart, let's say he stopped caring about what he did or didn't do, right? It wouldn't take that long before he'd realize that that has consequences. That really brings a lot of pain. So I think it's something that like people when they first hear about it, that's a reaction, but I think it's more a rhetorical reaction than something that they'd actually live by. Throughout the cultures of the world, I don't think there's one that's ever developed like a quote unquote fatalistic attitude toward life. The Stoics kind of like were, well, like we're going to be happy regardless and all, but that's a different matter. So I think people may say that, all right, life isn't going to have any meaning and all, but I think it's saying that and actually just, it's much, much harder to kind of like live by that kind of like conclusion.
That might bring people back into free will belief. They may not necessarily keep the idea of no free will, unless they have a good, logical, intelligent, rational way to refute fatalism. If they're not given that, if they don't have those arguments available for them to learn from, they might go right back into free will because they might
Yeah.
say, well, determinism is fatalism. I don't like fatalism, therefore I'm going back into free will.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that we shouldn't explain, the difference and this, basically refute fatalism. I mean, like, or just like show that it's illogical. I think certainly you're right. It's part of this whole thing we're doing. What I'm saying is like I don't think some people, for example, worry that if we abandon this free will belief, society is going to collapse. And I try to explain, no, society is not going to collapse because we're hedonic creatures. We not just as individuals, but as society seek pleasure and avoid pain. So we're not going to let it collapse. So in that same way, yes, it's like with fatalism, um, I think the other part of what we're doing is actually hopefully we're going to like describe to people how harmful the belief in free will is. That even if a person, you know, became a fatalist, then said, "Well, I'm going to go back to free will," I think they'd realize that the free will belief is actually even worse.
Yeah, George, I agree because I think free will belief is much worse, causes much more harm, and is much more depressing than even fatalism because I was suicidal as a free will believer years ago because of the belief that, oh, I'm a dirty, rotten sinner deserving of hell. You know what I've been taught in Christianity and that kind of stuff. And it's so even if somebody does become a fatalist and they don't truly understand the difference between fatalism and determinism, and they, as long as they understand that free will is false, you know, understanding that either causality or a causality does not allow for free will, and that they can't blame themselves for anything. They can't blame themselves for their depression. They can't blame themselves for things. I think that that's still psychologically much healthier and will probably keep someone alive longer so that we have time to explain how, no, fatalism isn't the right conclusion, determinism is, you know?
You want to hear something, a little funny anecdote? A couple days ago, I overslept, and I had to be somewhere. I had an appointment, and I really wanted to sleep, but I really wanted to go to the appointment. And because I am a hard determinist, hard incompatibilist, at that moment something clicked in my head and said, "Hey, I wonder who's going to win." You know what I mean? And I just like, and for a moment I'm like, I wonder which urge is stronger. You know, instead of being under this illusion that I'm controlling what's happening, instead I sat back like an observer, wondering which direction am I going to go in. And eventually I went to the appointment. And that's how I view reality now. Like, you know, as George alluded to, that hedonistic principle, that hedonic principle. It's like, I know why I ended up going to the appointment, because there's reasons, there's something I want. I have a strong desire, I have strong urges, and the fact that reality is a certain way doesn't change that. Would you start torturing yourself because free will doesn't exist? No, because it's very painful. It's horrible. It doesn't feel good. You know what I mean? So I don't see why people, unless people are not thoroughly educated about the issue, why people would think that society at large would necessarily become fatalistic, given that they have sufficient information about the consequences of free will skepticism.
Yeah, you know, and here's the thing, guys. I mean, we all know, I think, except when we get into very irrational states of mind, we all know that things happen because of our actions. We understand that you're not going to be less hungry until you eat. We get that, and so we eat. You know, so it's not like things are going to fatalistically happen without us doing something to cause them. And so I think most people, I mean, hopefully that shouldn't need to be explained because our experience every day shows us that. But the whole free will debate is about whether it's fundamentally up to us, like if our entire situation was caused by us, which we know it can't be. So yeah.
Going back to George, was something you said. Was there ever a society that was fatalistic? If my memory serves me correct, I think that the Aztecs were actually fatalistic in that they thought that there would be a god that would return from the east, and they predicted on a certain day or a certain year that they would come, and the Spanish came right at that year, and they essentially gave their whole empire to the Spanish, and it led to the destruction of the Aztecs by Hernando Cortez in back in I think 1519 or so, almost 500 years ago.
I think that's
And
what you
I
call the
think,
self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
yeah, something.
Because
Yeah.
But
it did
I
lead to the
think that
destruction of the Aztecs. They were right.
the Aztecs were to a certain degree fatalistic. They thought that this would be the end of their empire, and when their conquerors came, they
Yes.
basically just gave the conquerors the power.
Well, this brings up another point, guys. You know how there's always some group of Christians who are predicting, oh well, Jesus will return on a certain day of a certain month of a certain year at a certain location. Well, here there's several problems with this. First of all, it's against what Jesus supposedly said in the Bible that no one knows the day or the hour or whatever. So it's wrong of them, according to their own religion, to be predicting these dates. But let's think of it from another perspective. Let's just even say that this God does exist, that this God will return. Okay, as soon as some human predicts when he's going to return, he says, you know what, to prove this human wrong, I'm going to delay my coming. You get what I'm saying? Because as soon as you predict the future and tell somebody, I predict, it has been revealed to me by the Holy Spirit that Chandler Klebs will eat Cheerios on this day, well, then I go out and buy some Raisin Bran and eat that instead, just to prove them wrong.
Want to know how some fundamentalists try to get around that? It says in the Bible that no one knows the day or the hour. They'll say, well, I don't know the day or the hour, but I know the week.
Wow, isn't it interesting how people find ways to get around these things?
Yeah. So it's going to be sometime between Sunday and Saturday, but I don't know the hour or the day.
Logical.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, predicting the future, prophecy, fortune telling has its own set of problems because here's what happens is like let's say people, they believe in fortune telling. They go to a psychic or a fortune teller and they're told by this fortune teller that day they're going to meet somebody who's going to be their future spouse, okay? So here's what happens. Then they meet somebody that day, and because they have this belief based on what they were told by the psychic that this person is going to be their future spouse, that causes them to pursue dating this person, and they do end up marrying this person. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense, because their belief that something was meant to be is what caused them to act in a way that brought it about. So that's why prophecy and fortune telling works, is because it changes people's belief system.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I dated this woman once a couple years back, and she thought the whole thing was part of destiny, like it was fate, and because I had guessed her zodiac sign, and I guess I said all the right things that night, and she thought like, oh my God, this is destiny, this was fated to happen, and she was like so freaking into me, man, because of that, you know.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting, the kinds of tricks that our brains play on us and how beliefs impact the way we view certain events. But yeah, I think that we've addressed two things about the morality being separate from moral responsibility and about the determinism versus fatalism. I hope that we've covered that. We're almost at an hour, so was there anything we wanted to say before we close this episode?
I think we addressed everything.
Yeah, I think that's good.
We even fit Hitler in.
Yeah, of course. An episode is never complete without mentioning Hitler.
We started with the Facebook guy. Was there any? I think that was pretty much those were the two main things to address the person on Facebook, right?
Yeah, I think so. So hopefully that will help, and I'll send him the link too, so that he can listen to what we had to say on the matter. Okay. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, Trick Slattery, Mitch J., and Michael Walsh. We talked about, the difference between determinism and fatalism. We talked about the difference between morality and moral responsibility, and how we don't have free will, but this doesn't mean that our concepts of morality are nullified, nor does it mean that we have to become fatalistic and think what we do doesn't matter. So hopefully we've cleared up a lot of confusion in this episode, but if there's anything that we haven't covered and you're still curious about, then we'll cover it in a future episode. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.